So our next presenter is going to be Michael Mack, back to Toronto, to the Department of Psychology, where he leads a lab that's interested in learning, and in particular, trying to study how attention and memory interact in the process of learning. And I think cognitive computational modeling, functional imaging, and behavioral experiments are the fundamental basis of the work over there. And the presentation is going to be on characterizing neural mechanisms with cognitive modeling. So we very much look forward to that presentation.
Okay, great. Just quick check that everyone can hear me. All right, thumbs up, good. Well, thank you for the introduction. And I gotta say, it's really great to be here at this workshop. I was excited to give this talk a year ago, and that excitement has managed to hold steady ever since. The big reason I was excited by this workshop in particular was this sort of overarching theme, which is asking, here it goes, sorry. What does the mind think of the brain? Now, much of my research approach is actually described by this question. So I'm kind of happy to be able to share my perspective on this question. Now, when I think of the mind, I think of formal cognitive models. And we've already seen some work talked about today, looking at some very formal, nice, beautiful cognitive models. We have well over a century's worth of empirical studies in psychology that have been key for building these rich theories that explain our behavior, how we act, how we learn, how we remember and decide. And many of these theories have been formalized into mathematical models that make explicit the latent computations, representations, all of the sort of elements of our mind and all the things that underlie our behavior. And these formal cognitive models move well beyond just simple description. They provide quantitative predictions about behavior. So for example, there's a whole class of models on categorization and category learning that can predict not only that you likely saw this object as a tulip rather than a rose, but also how quickly you arrived at that decision. So these cognitive models provide powerful and sophisticated tools for characterizing and evaluating cognitive theories in light of behavior. Of course, in parallel, a vast and rich understanding of the brain has also emerged from over a century of neuroscience research. The sort of odd thing about this is that these two approaches have sort of largely grown up independently, at least not without much crosstalk. That is until the last decade or so, where people really jumped on the opportunity to view the brain through the lens of cognitive models to sort of better understand how to perform brain analyses, how to look for these sort of well-defined cognitive mechanisms that we see in these models, look for evidence of that in neural measures. And this is actually a two-way street. So brain findings can also be used to constrain and update our models. So today, I wanted to give kind of a brief and broad overview of some of this work to show how cognitive models have been leveraged to understand neural mechanisms. And sort of caveats right at the beginning, by no means will this be comprehensive. I'm purposefully sticking pretty close to my own research area because it's the stuff that I'm most familiar with. But I hope that this will serve as kind of a nice entry point for anyone that's interested in these approaches. You also see that there's a URL there on the bottom of the screen. At this webpage, I have the slides here that I'm presenting, but also a list of papers with links, things that I think are most relevant to this topic. I'd say it's very much incomplete. I'm going to actually add to it over the next couple of days. But if you just want to take note of this and refer back to it later, it's there for a resource. I'm actually putting this together for my students too, so I didn't do it just for you. Right? Okay, so to give this sort of brief but broad overview, I wanted to first talk about what a cognitive model is. And like I said earlier, already we've seen what a cognitive model is, but I want to do this with an example from my own research domain, so category learning. This is our ability to learn how to organize and label stimuli from the world according to shared perceptual and semantic features, right? It's how we actually organize our experiences in our lives. Now, in a category learning task, it's much less dramatic than that. We have to sort through some sort of information that we're presented with, say, visual objects like these flowers. And we have to figure out what's relevant for the goal at hand. So, for example, this would be a task that many of my participants have actually done. You have to decide which of these flowers grow better in the sun versus the shade. And you might notice that there are some sort of potentially important differences between these different flowers. Some of them have pointy petals, some of them have round petals. There's differences in color. And of course, at the beginning, you have no idea. You're just going to be guessing. But you do get feedback on those guesses, and you can start to learn some things. So if you learn that these two flowers here correspond to their different categories, you might make the hypothesis that, okay, maybe petal shape matters. Now, as you continue the experiment and you're getting feedback, you're probably going to quickly pick up that it's not petal shape that matters, but it's actually the color of this inner ring. And by sort of paying attention to this one feature, this inner ring color, we're actually internally reorganizing these flowers into a representational space that's consistent with this learning goal, right? And this is a nice intuition, right? That we can actually learn to successfully categorize stimuli by reorganizing our category knowledge. And depending on, if there's a task, the learning goal switches, you might reorganize that conceptual knowledge to best align with that new goal. But the way that we seem to do this organization is through this process of selective attention. We attend to just that one feature that seems to matter the most and ignore those that don't. So this is a great intuition, and that's how most cognitive models start. You have a great intuition, you think about it, but to really understand sort of what are the predictions of this theory, you have to make it concrete. And this is where a formal cognitive model comes into play. Now, one of the most sort of successful, long-standing models in the categorization world is the generalized context model by Rob Nosofsky. It's also known as the exemplar model. And I want to use this as just an example to sort of illustrate what are the things that are made up of, or what are cognitive models made up of, right? So the first thing that the exemplar model provides is a description of the representations, right? So you're learning to categorize these stimuli into different categories. You're going to represent them in a particular way. So first of all, in the exemplar model, categories are represented by individual exemplars of those categories. So every time you've seen a flower in your life that prefers the sun, it gets stored in a multidimensional perceptual space. This perceptual space corresponds to the features that the stimuli are composed of. So any point in this multidimensional space is a flower. And they are tagged with their category, right? So you have a whole set of flowers that like the sun, a whole set of flowers that like the shade. An important aspect of this model is that these representations can be biased by attention. So if you learn that, sunflowers look like these guys, shade flowers look like these guys, you're going to learn that this dimension here of color is what really matters. And selective attention is formalized as a weight on this, where you actually highlight that diagnostic dimension and compress information along those irrelevant dimensions like the petal shape. So we have these attention-weighted, multi-dimensional perceptual spaces that define the representation of this model. Now, of course, the real guts of the model come from the computations. And this is a relatively simple model, and it really only has a few computations here that define it, which is maybe why I'm talking about it as an example. But the main idea in the computations is that the similarity between any two items in this model depends on their distance in this representational space, right? So you simply calculate the distance between an item. That tells you how similar are they to the observer, right? And so you can see the distance calculation is in this top equation. You might recognize this as sort of a generalized distance function or Minkowski distance. If r was set to 2, you'd end up with Euclidean distance. If it's set to 1, you'd end up with a city block distance. So we have distance in there, but it's weighted by this attention parameter w. So for dimension I, you can have an attention weight. And this actually acts to highlight it if it's important, or downweight it if that's not an important dimension. Now from the distance, you can actually calculate similarity. And you take the distance, raise it with exponent, that turns short distances into high similarities and vice versa. I'd actually come up with a category decision, right, to actually turn this into some sort of prediction of behavior. Let's say we get a new item that shows up in this space. We want to decide, make that categorization. Does it like the sun or the shade? Calculate the distance to all the items in that sun category, turn those into similarities and sum them. You also do it for the other categories too. So the distance to all the shade flowers, sum their similarity, and then you use this very simple softmax decision rule, right? So the summed similarity for that first category is divided by the sum similarity for all the categories. And this gives you a probability that the observer is going to pick that category for this item, right? The closer it is to those category exemplars, the more likely you're going to say it belongs to that category. So very simple predictions, but they are quantitative predictions. And from this, you can actually derive predictions about how people are going to respond after a particular learning task, where they've learned that a certain set of items are associated with particular categories. Now, this has been a very important model, and one that's been shown to generalize to many, many categorization tasks. And so in a normal task, you'd have your participant come in, they'd likely bring their brain, and they're going to give you decisions about these categorizations, right? They're going to learn how to categorize these flowers. At the beginning, they're not going to do so well. They're just guessing, but over time, that error rate's going to drop down. They will have learned this task. Now you have your model that can do the same thing. And the key thing here is to fit that model to participants' behavior. So you adjust those attention weights, you adjust the other parameters in that model, and you get it to behave in the same way that participants did. Now, the conventional way to do this is say, all right, well, if the model in this particular parameter set can behave in the same way that the participants do, then we can make this sort of indirect inference and say, okay, they're giving us the same behavior. However, the model is set up with this parameter set, with this formalization for representations, this is likely what's happening in that participant's brain. And this is what cognitive modeling has been doing for decades, right? You have this indirect path through behavior that gets you to an inference about the brain. The key idea here, though, is that we don't need to limit ourselves to this indirect inference. With advances in neuroimaging, we can now directly sort of leverage these latent mechanisms and representations, the computations of these well-specified models to understand brain function. We can use those to help us understand, what are the neural mechanisms that give rise to something like successful category learning. So this is the key idea that I want to talk about today. And this offers a lot of potential for understanding neural mechanisms in a way that actually reflects cognitive theory. But making this link between model and brain is also a significant challenge. So I'd like to present 3 different ways that this link can be made by focusing on the different aspects of cognitive models, namely their computations, their representations, and their ability to define what I'm going to call critical moments. You sort of think of these as important state changes in the model. And across all 3 of these, we should see that they should be reflected in the brain if we are dealing with a model that tells us something true about sort of how people make decisions. So let's start with computation. So a cognitive model is, of course, defined by its formal computations. It's the heart of the model. It's how input is transformed into these latent measures and variables that impact our behavior. So the key idea here is that if a model is actually true and its latent computations capture the type of mental processes that drive our behavior, then these model computations should be reflected in neural computation and potentially even apparent in brain measures. So to make this bridge between model and brain, you first need that latent measure from the model. One that reflects some sort of computation or quantity that's relevant to the task at hand, and one that also varies across time or trial. So an example of this would be this sum similarity calculation that I was just talking about from the exemplar model. This will vary depending on how well the current item from the current trial actually matches what you've previously experienced, right? And so we can expect this to vary across time. So this gives us sort of a nice signature of this very important decision variable within the model. Now you also need a time varying neural measure, which in the case of fMRI is exactly what you get, right? A bold time series. We're looking at how specific locations in the brain vary in activation over time. So we kind of already have that, which is great if you're doing fMRI. Now to link these two, you simply take this latent model measure and enter it into a univariate GLM as a parametric regressor. And if you can find that there's a region in the brain or multiple regions in the brain that their activation across time correlates with this model measure, then that's good evidence that that model's computation is actually being computed in the brain. So this is actually a relatively simple idea. As long as you have the model, you can fit it to behavior, you can pull out this measure, and you've just scanned at least 40 people. Now, the hard part's done. You can look for these correlations using a standard univariate analysis. So let's quickly talk about an example of this from the category learning literature. So Tyler Davis, Ellie Preston, Brad Love looked at this in their 2012 paper in cerebral cortex. And what they did is they had participants perform a rule plus exception learning task. So this is the type of category learning task that we encounter all the time in the real world. You have items from a category that follow these really simple sort of rules. All birds fly. But then there are some exceptions that violate those rules, right? So bats fly, but they are not birds, right? So they sort of count as an exception item. Now in this task, what they did is they had people learn to categorize these items that sort of followed this rule plus exception. So we had these horrible beetles that people had to learn to categorize. And some of them followed a simple category rule. So if they have thick legs, then they belong in hole A. If they have thin legs, they belong in hole B. But then there are some exception items. These guys circled in red. They violate those rules. And if you take a category learning model, they actually used one called sustain. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about sustain throughout this talk. But sustain is similar to the exemplar model that I just talked about, sort of a pseudo neural network model of this idea. But the important thing about sustain is it predicts that people can form these abstract representations. They form representations that average over experiences or average over stimuli. And it actually will form these nice prototypical representations that correspond to those rule followers. But for the exceptions, it uniquely represents them in all of their features. So you almost have a snapshot of what this exception looks like in this model. So you have the combination of abstracted, more prototype-like representations, and then very specific exception representations. And what they looked at as a signature of this, this representational structure was the computation of recognition strength. So the model basically calculates something like we see in the denominator of this category probability computation that I just talked about. And it's just the overall, how much does the current item activate your stored category knowledge? So across both categories, both whole A beetles and whole B beetles, how much does this item activate them? How similar is it to those items? And what you get is a very different signal depending on whether you're looking at those rule followers, which we see here in green, and the exception, which we see here in red. Because the exception items are distinctly represented and all of their features are represented, you have a much stronger recognition strength. Whereas the more abstracted representations for the rule followers, it matches, for the most part, most of those stimuli, but not everything about them. So it gives you more of a medium level recognition strength. Now, the key thing here is that it's not just a difference. It's not just a simple contrast. This function varies across time. At the beginning, these two signals are very similar. They separate more over time, and they have this very odd nonlinearity that happens as a function of how sustained learns. So it's actually a very unique signature of this model's computations. So like I said, once you have the model, you have all the behavior, it's a simple process to look at the brain now, right? Where in the brain correlates with this time varying model measure. And what they found is that it's actually in the hippocampus and parts of mediotemporal lobe cortex, where we get this correspondence between the model computation of recognition strength and the bold signal and how it changes over time. And so the inferences you can draw here is that this model predicted cognitive measure of recognition strength is actually present in the brain. And that gives some credence to the model, right? This was Sustain was a behavioral model. It was designed basically agnostic to the brain. Don't tell Brad Love I said that, but yeah, it wasn't created to give us predictions about the brain, yet from its latent measures, we can see that there's evidence of it in the brain. This also tells us something about the type of computations that are being performed in the hippocampus and MTL cortex, right? It seems to be calculating recognition strength as Sustain does. So this gives us a nice link between model and brain. Now, to give credit where credit's due, this idea of taking a time varying signal from a model and linking it to a time varying signal in the brain was really popularized and sort of brought to the forefront by people doing research in reinforcement learning, in particular Nathaniel Daw, John O'Doherty, Peter Diane, Ben Seymour, and Ray Dolan kind of gave us the first sort of studies on this, and then really have done a ton of research using this approach that's been labeled model-based fMRI. They looked at how people make decisions in a four-armed bandit task, and they can use reinforcement learning models that sort of track participants' beliefs and sort of what are the values of these different bandits and how their payoffs might change over time. Using this approach, they're able to localize sort of the probability of a choice that a participant made that seems to be coded in medial prefrontal cortex activation. And I'm not going to get into the details here other than to say that this was one of the sort of seminal studies of this approach. And I'm actually going to come back to it when we get to critical moments of learning, or critical moments from the model in the third part. Now, this approach is very sort of, it gives you a lot of information, but it's also sort of depends on this correlation, right? You have a model measure and you're correlating it with a neural measure. And so it's very sort of one directional. We go from model to brain, and that's great, right? That there's plenty to be learned from that. But I was interested in my postdoc in sort of flipping this arrow around. And can we actually use the brain to constrain cognitive theory? Can we actually use the brain to help us select between two competing theories with the idea that a model that is true and actually represents a cognitive computation, you should be able to decode that information from that model in patterns of brain response. And you should be able to decode it better than a competing model that is not as true as the first one. And so this idea here to investigate this, we had people learn a category learning task. This is a classic one from Medine and Schaefer. Participants learned that there's some A items, they learned some B items, then they went into the scanner and made decisions about this whole set that included included the original A and B items, as well as a transfer set of these simple shapes. So very, very simple shapes. And what we were interested in is whether in a model that has these category exemplars, where you have individual items that represent all of your sort of experiences with those different categories, is that model a better account of these category decisions, or a prototype model, which we have here on the right? So rather than exemplars, you have a single prototypical representation for your categories, right? It's sort of the average of all of the features of items that are in that category. Now, these models are actually very similar. The only thing that differs between them is their representations. Do you have exemplars or do you have prototypes? But you can see this difference in representation in their computation. So again, looking at this idea of recognition strength, you have a new item on the screen, you need to calculate, is this an A item or a B item? You can look at how it activates all of your stored category representations. And this is the type of recognition strength you would get from the two models. And you can tell that they're very different, right? Basically, if you look at the prototypes, it's only those items that are very similar to the prototypes that give you a very strong recognition signal. So we asked, can we take patterns of brain activation and in a multivariate analysis, predict this continuous measure of recognition strength? And can we do so such that we find more evidence in these brain patterns for one of these models, the exemplar model or the prototype model? We did this with a support vector regression approach. And we actually found in a majority of our participants, more evidence for exemplar theory rather than prototype theory. But a key point here is that we were actually able to do it on an individual participant level. And so we did have a majority of participants were more exemplary, and a smaller minority of participants were more prototypey. And actually some follow-up work to this done by Dasha Zaitimova has talked about sort of different strategies that people might have that could lead to these different types of representations. But the type of inference that you can draw from this sort of model brain link is that there are exemplar model computations that are being calculated in the brain, at least in a majority of our participants. And we're actually able to select. We are able to pick between competing models based on activation patterns in the brain. All right, so this was the second way that you can sort of form this model to brain link using a model's computation. Now, the third way that I want to talk about for computation is one that I'm kind of most excited about. And this is where you put the focus back on the model and you say, can we take parts of this model, parts of these mechanisms, parameters, something in the equations basically, that has some important cognitive description. Can we replace this with brain signal? If this model is true and it is actually capturing something about how the brain works and some of the computations that are occurring in the brain, we should be able to grab that brain signal, inject it into our model, and it can now provide a better account of our behavior. Right? That's a tall order. We know how noisy the brain is, especially with fMRI signal. But if a model is true, and if it's providing a good account of the type of computations that are being performed, then being able to show this bridge would be very strong evidence. Now, this was really kind of first shown by Jim Craigle, Neil Morton, and Sean Paulin. And it was in a free recall paradigm. So they had participants study word lists, the most exciting task in the world. then they, in the scanner, need to do free recall. So they just try to recall as many of those words that they studied. There's this a giant world in computational modeling that deals with free recall predictions, right? So you have a model. There's the context retrieval maintenance model, which is kind of the most popular version of this. And basically what it says is that when you encode items into memory, you encode contextual features. So you encode things about the last word you just encoded, you encode things about what happened to you earlier that day. You might encode something about the lunch that you just had, but whatever it is, you have this sort of drifting contextual, these contextual features that get encoded along with the fact that you just saw the word salt, right? Now later, when you retrieve that from memory in that free recall paradigm, you remember salt, but you also retrieve those contextual features, and those contextual features drive what you're going to recall next. And so depending on what you encode in context and what you retrieve from context, that dictates the type of memories that you will retrieve. Now, this has been a very important model, one that explains behavior really well. But to link this to the brain is really kind of the big next step. And the way that they did this is they said, well, we think that this contextual retrieval is something that's done by the hippocampus and medial temporal lobe cortex, right? These regions of the brain that are well known, established roles in memory. Can we use the neural signal from them to replace parts of our model, to actually extend our model? So I'm not going over the details of this. This is obviously a very complicated approach. And if you're interested in this, I would highly recommend reading this paper. It's really great. But what they did is they extracted bold time series from voxels within MTL and fed those, injected those straight into their model, and basically could make predictions on how people are going to retrieve items from memory on a trial by trial basis based on this neural activation. And when they did this, they actually found that there are regions in this, their ROI where they're looking. So all of these orange voxels here, if you inject the bold time series from these voxels into their model, it provides a better account of their behavior, right? So they've actually replaced these important components that dictate sort of the degree of context retrieval, something that's actually difficult to estimate just from behavior alone. They could get this time varying bold signal that actually directly relates to how people are going to retrieve on a trial by trial basis. So this is a very powerful sort of method of evaluating neural signal based on a cognitive model, and one where they've flipped this arrow around in an impressive way. Now, they've had very specific hypotheses about the neural mechanisms of context encoding and retrieval. So they targeted the medial temporal lobe. But recently in my lab, we've extended this idea to a broader scale, basically asking if we can characterize neural signal across the brain in terms of its ability to predict category decision-making on a trial by trial basis. I'm not going to go into the details here, but basically what we're trying to do is replace GLM, our sort of standard univariate statistical approach, replace that with a cognitive model. And what we did is we took a drift diffusion model, a model of decision-making, one that's been around since the 70s. It predicts that decisions are made by a random walk evidence accumulation process, where in a given trial, you have evidence that's going to randomly walk to reach a threshold, at which point you make your response. And that evidence can depend on the type of perceptual encoding that you're doing, how well that matches in a category decision context, how well it matches your stored category representations. But the cool thing about the drift diffusion models, it gives you not only the choice that you make, so like say category A versus category B, but how quickly it took you to make that. So you get response times as well. So it gives you a much more comprehensive account of behavior. And so we asked, can we inject neural signal, trial by trial changes in neural signal into the diffusion model and get a better account of people's category decision making. And we did it in a whole brain approach. We parcellated the brain according to the Schaefer Atlas. We had 108 ROIs. We took the average time series within those ROIs and fed that into the model and fit it using this hierarchical Bayesian estimation of the drift diffusion model. And what we found is when you basically discard your GLM, use instead a cognitive model, we now find in our task, at least, that we have this lateral prefrontal cortex region that when included in the cognitive model actually gave us a better account of behavior than if we didn't include it, right? You would expect that you take this super noisy signal, inject it into a cognitive model, it's just going to give you a bunch of noise. That's not what we found. It actually gave us a better explanation, a better account of people's decision making. And it explained both their response choices and their response times. So here we can see we're really kind of starting to bringing models and brain closer together, a step closer to sort of having an integrated unifying theory, although still very separate. There's still some big walls that stand between these two approaches. So we can see here that obviously looking at the heart of a model, looking at its computations can give you important insight and important sort of targets for the type of signal you should see and mechanisms in the brain that would be correlated and underlying these acts of cognition that you care about. But there's much more to look at in models. In particular, they have often, especially in the category learning world, important predictions about representation, right? So we have these representations, and we saw in the exemplar model, this idea that there are, it's multidimensional perceptual space where each item that you see sort of now resides, it gets encoded into this multidimensional space. And the relationship between these items that are stored in these different representations are sort of key to the type of category decisions that people make. So to make this link between model and brain based on a model's representation, the key idea is that these representations underlying the model should also be found in neural signals and patterns. This is very similar to the idea of the computation, but we have to look at this in a little bit of a different way. So what you need to make this link is you need to, from your model, pull out these representations. They might be something like this multi-dimensional perceptual space that we saw in the exemplar model. They could be unit activations in different layers of a neural network model. Whatever they might be, you need to sort of abstract some sort of structure out of them. So how are they related to each other? You could simply take the correlation between these different unit activations. You could look at the similarity based on distance that we see in the exemplar model. But what you want to construct would be a similarity matrix. And this defines how are these different items related to each other in the model, right? So these are model-based predictions of these representations. And we need the same thing from the brain. Obviously, the type of representations you're going to have in the brain are going to be vastly different than what you find in your model. And so instead, you can also look at this similarity structure, right? And if you're doing fMRI, you can look at these activation patterns for your different items. And these could be localized to a small region. It could be a large region, could be across the whole brain, although I'm not sure you'd find much difference there. You can pull out these representations that include multiple voxels and their activity and correlate them, right? So you get pairwise correlations and you end up with a similarity matrix. So by putting both model and brain in the shared currency of representational similarity, you can now ask if they correlate. Is there a correspondence between how the model represents things and how the brain represents things? And are these representations impacted by different factors and mechanisms in the same manner as these model predicted representations? Now, I'm going to quickly talk about an example of this that I did to look at how attention, again, back to this idea that attention in these category learning models actually distorts our representations, right? So it highlights the features that matter, that dimension that matters, and it compresses the features that don't. So we get this distortion in our category learning model that happens by attention. The question then is, do we see the same sort of distortion in neural representations while participants are doing this task? Now, the way that I looked at this was to show participants, again, they got to look at these horrible bugs. They had to learn to categorize them according to a very simple category structure. The different colors here represent the different categories, and you can see it's the structure of the leg that actually matters here. That's how it's depicted. They learn through feedback-based learning. You know, they make their best guess, they get feedback, and over time they learn to categorize them. After they've learned them, we now switch it. So same stimuli, same bugs, but now they're categorizing them in a different way. The category structure is very different. It's actually more complex. But the key thing here is that they're doing two tasks, and across both tasks, the visual input is the same, but the attentional demand changes, right? So if people can learn in these tasks, and they can, then we should expect that those representations are going to be changing across the two tasks. And we can understand how they change by using a computational model. And we use sustain. So I made reference to this earlier, but sustain is this learning model. It has feature-based attention, which we see in this first layer. It highlights those features most diagnostic for a task. That information is fed up into a clustering layer. And the clustering layer actually builds representations that best represent the regularities that you see in your task. So if two items are very similar, it grabs those items and combines them into sort of a more abstract representation. If something's very unique, it will distinctly represent that. But it serves as kind of the internal memory of the model. We took this model, fit it to participants' behavior, and you can look at things like attention weights, and you can see that participants are looking at the features they ought to, at least according to the model, right? So we have a lot of attention here to the one feature that matters for this task. And in the type 2, where we now have two features that matter, attention has shifted. So now they're looking at these. And these, this difference in attention weighting is actually reflected in their representations. So you can look at the cluster layer. How does each stimulus activate these different clusters? You can correlate those cluster activations, and you end up with these similarity matrices, where each cell here represents a pairwise similarity or pairwise correlation between two stimulus pairs. And you can see that things, the task really changes these model predictions, right? It's the exact same visual input. They're looking at the same bugs, but attention changes how these are represented. Now this serves as our index of how the model is representing the stimuli, and we can now use this to interrogate representations in the brain. So we have our attentional weighted model predicted representations. We have the pairwise correlations between patterns in the brain for those same stimuli, and we can ask, where do these correlate? Where do we see a match? Now, we were focused on hippocampus, and what we found is that there was this region in the hippocampus, anterior region here, where we see that representations reflect the type of representations that sustain is actually predicting, right? So we now have this link that's a link based on the similarity structure in their representations. And it's important to note that we only found this when we were considering the full predictions of sustain, right? We needed selective attention. We needed these cluster-based memory encoding. If we just looked at simple sort of category membership, these two items belong to the same category, that doesn't reveal the type of neural representation that we see here. So by the fact that we have to incorporate both of these, or all of the sort of mechanisms of sustain, really suggest that this region of the hippocampus is doing something very, very similar to what sustain is predicting. Now, in the interest of time, I'm going to skip over this next part here. But just very briefly, I wanted to say, these type of predictions that we're looking at here are very, very specific, right? We're talking about attention, we're talking about stimulus features, and you can end up with predictions from a model that are incredibly specific and maybe too specific. And there's, different ways to look at representation. And I would, if you're interested in this sort of more simpler idea, you could check out this paper here. It's a 2020 paper in Nature Communications, where we looked at how conceptual complexity, the fact that you can have different tasks that depend on a different number of dimensions, how you can look at that with principal component analysis of neural representations, sort of a different way to sort of bridge representation that doesn't require these very fine, precise quantitative predictions of stimuli. It's in MPFC. And you can relate it back to the model, of course. So the last thing I wanted to talk about are critical moments in cognitive model predictions. So these critical moments are moments that only with a model could you predict that there's going to be important state changes, right? And we actually, to do this, you need that model that gives you the sort of latent model state changes across time. And here I have represented this idea that on any given trial in a category learning task, you might create a new memory representation, or if that current item is similar to what you've already experienced, you might just update that one. So you have two sort of fundamental memory operations that are occurring. And the model can actually give you something to leverage when those events are occurring. So this basically gives you a model-derived, event regressor for a GLM analysis. And it's something that you can't get from just behavior alone. Now, actually in that original sort of reinforcement learning paper that I referenced before, this was kind of the really cool thing that they did. So in these forearm bandit tasks, you have people choosing between these different arms. Some of them are giving you a higher payoff than others, and people seem to engage in either exploitation strategies where they exploit what they know, or exploration where they see if there's another one that might be giving you a better payoff. And based on the predictions from their model, they could define when they had an explore trial or an exploit trial, and look at contrasts in the brain that identify sort of what is the neural activation that's going to relate to these state changes. And they were able to localize this into the regions you see here. Right? And you could only get this by using the model, right? Again, sort of reiterate that point. Now, the way that I've looked at this is to look at this idea that category knowledge is built through sort of these fundamental memory operations. If you see something new and you're trying to learn how to categorize this item, if it's not similar to what you've experienced before, you're going to create a new memory trace. But if it is very similar, you're going to take that new information and update the existing representation that you already have. This is actually what is happening in this clustering layer of the model's sustain that I've been talking a lot about. The cool thing about this is you can fit participants' behavior and then peek inside the model and see when did it actually create a new memory trace and when did it update a new memory trace. Now, actually being able to do this with a very precisely controlled experiment is, that's a disaster. It's not going to work, right? So you can get this sort of nice fine prediction of when these state changes or these different functions, memory encoding functions, are occurring by using a model. And that's going to vary for different participants, right? On one trial, one participant might be creating a memory. On another, on a different trial for a different participant, you're going to have updates. And a model can actually deal with those individual differences. So we had participants do a lot of category learning trials. They did 4 of them, 4 different separate tasks. We fit their behavior with sustain, and then peeked inside to get these model predicted events. You know, when are memories being created? When are they being updated? And if that model is actually identifying key moments in learning, then these different memory operations, if the model is identifying key moments in learning when these different memory operations are occurring, then we should expect that neural engagement will track these sort of fundamental events. So we have this regressor, we put it in a GLM analysis, univariate analysis, and what popped up with the hippocampus? We see that the hippocampus actually engages differently for create versus update trials. So this model predicted signature of when these critical moments in learning are occurring. Striatum also did. And you might start to guess that, like, I'm a hippocampus fan based on the tone that I just said that. But you know, what we could do sort of to push us even further is say, all right, well, can we actually explain individual differences in learning, right? If we look at sort of this early on activity in the hippocampus or striatum, does that predict how well participants perform later on? And we found that, in fact, it was the hippocampus that did that. So the more that the hippocampus differentially engaged to create versus update trials, the better a participant learned. And this wasn't true in the striatum. So really only by integrating these model-based predictions of when memory creation versus updating occurs, can we isolate the sort of key neural signature of learning to the hippocampus. And because this is the brain connectivity workshop, I wanted to throw this last thing in. This is actually ongoing. I'm not too confident in this slide, so maybe I shouldn't be showing you this. But since we have this time like event regressor, now we can do simple things. Like whenever you have some sort of condition regressor, you can do all of the analyses that you normally would with that. It doesn't matter that it came from a model. So, you know, I've looked at differences in functional connectivity between these two memory operations, and I'm finding that there are, you know, different networks that seem to be associated with them. Although this is preliminary, and I wouldn't bet on any of these analyses, you know, holding up, but maybe. So across all three of these different components of a model, we have different ways of linking a model to neural function, right? Their computations, their representations, and how they can identify these sort of critical moments specific to a cognitive task. Now, what thing that is missing, at least in my domain, is the link to connectivity. And that's why I'm excited to talk about this here, because you would expect that interactions between different model mechanisms would also be reflected in neural interactions. But there's not a lot of work, at least in category learning, that makes this link. And so maybe you guys can figure it out. A couple things I just wanted to point, you know, moving forward, what's the future of this? There's whole models out there of the brain, and a lot of these brain models, like the virtual brain, can give sort of emergent predictions of cognition. So we can actually take these models, have them give us, you know, these predictions for cognition and relate them back to our cognitive models, which means we're having models talking to models, and we no longer need to have participants, which is really great. And actually, we've been doing some work on this, looking at a hippocampus model that is giving us very nice predictions that suggest that attention doesn't matter at all. And if you paid attention to my talk at all up to this point, that was the only thing I talked about. So we're trying to figure out how to reconcile this. And I think the real future would be exactly what Brandon Turner's doing and we'll be talking about on Thursday, and that's these joint models that actually combine cognition, computation, brain, all into one model. Another pointer to this webpage with relevant papers. And finally, thanks to Ali Preston, Brad Love. They were instrumental in sort of a lot of this work that I presented today.
And thank you very much to you, Michael.
Job.
A big hand representative for our large audience. That was really broadening our minds. And we learned a lot about bugs in the process.
Oh, I should say I've switched, right? So there's just flowers now that And if you want to download my flowers, they're there.
Okay, they're very pretty too. Maybe let's start off with the question from Susan Fitzpatrick, which she asked in the chat. Thinking about how much we do during every given day, how much of the findings here relate to behavior or to unnaturalistic, isolated task performance? So is this is your lab actually a peaceful heaven of quietness and isolation?
Well, it's actually gotten a lot less isolated with the pandemic, because now we're actually studying a lot of these tasks. Online, people are now participants from home, and we're finding basically that it's no different than if they were in our lab. And so I think that gives us a little bit of a leverage in claiming that it doesn't require this isolated learning task and learning environment. There's the big question is, how much is this, like if you learn something today, is it still there a week later? And what are the neural dynamics there? And we've actually started to look at this and seeing and trying to understand how things change over time, which has obvious like pedagogical inroads. And these are open questions. But the nice thing is that by having a cognitive model, you can apply it to different situations, and nothing's going to change in that cognitive model. So if we find that we get this link to the brain, then if we move to a more naturalistic, realistic situation, we can predict that same brain mechanism would be involved and test it. But then that still becomes an empirical question.
Susan, maybe you want to follow up directly?
Yeah, just to build on that a little bit. Thank you, Michael, for this really interesting talk. I wasn't so much indicating that there's something unnatural about the environment in which you're doing. It's the task that I'm interested in, that actually you're doing a very specific kind of learning task and saying this is the way that we learn. That is an empirical question, that we are focusing our attention on these fine details and building representations. That may not be the way we actually work through the world, but we have this capability of doing this when we're given a very rather simple, even you have 2 or 3 features. I mean, if you just think about that, we can recognize somebody by the way they walk, by the way they're sitting, by their profile, by the way they slump, the way they hold their coffee. I mean, we are encoding so many details all the time. I just can't imagine that we're doing it the way that we do it in these highly attentionally demanding tasks.
Right. So I agree that making that jump and understanding how to generalize that is key. And one way that we've started to do this, and other labs are doing this, is you take something like these deep neural nets that are great at categorizing everything in the world, and put those as basically front ends to these cognitive models. And you say, all right, give me 1,000 features that define these different objects. Can we basically crank up our cognitive models to deal with that amount of feature information? Brad Love has a student working on this right now, where he's basically trying to explain the whole literature on category learning with a single version of Sustain that has a deep learning vision model on the front end. And so this starts to get at much more like biologically plausible feature spaces and how these cognitive models would then act on them. Tom Palmieri's doing this too, and we've started to do a little bit with scene categories, using. We just had a paper accepted that defines these sort of continuous spaces where you can traverse through scene spaces, scene categories. And we're now using that in learning tasks to understand, where do people draw a line between like what's a kitchen and what's a dining room and these more naturalistic environments. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thanks. Randy, you also have a hand up.
Yeah, thanks. I don't want to take up too much time because we have some people in the audience as well, but I just wanted to ask quickly, Michael, about the time scale over which the neural signals evolving versus the models changing its parameters, and whether you found it surprising that FMR worked so well, for example, to filter through the model, given the fact that unless it's the case that the cognitive process you're modeling is working on the same time scale as fMRI, I thought it was kind of peculiar because you could have used, you could imagine, for example, using MEG or EEG or single units, and whether that would work equally well or not.
Right. What I didn't say is that we had like super long trials in that one study. So, you know, if it's within 10 seconds, okay, like I'm okay with that. And at that point, participants had already learned. And so if you're referring to one where we actually inject the neural signal into the model. So at that point, we don't expect there really to be learning going on. Hopefully not. So at that point, we think, you know, you're going to see the stimulus, it's going to impinge on your category knowledge in a certain way, and we're going to see that activation over our 10-second trials, and that's going to sort of reflect that well. But then obviously, you know, having a better temporal resolution would reveal some important differences. You know, the create versus update study I just talked about. Mm-hmm. The interesting thing about that is that the model is really dependent on feedback, right? You got to get the feedback to know if you're going to, you know, create new trials or update new trials. The neural signal is actually from stimulus presentation. So we're actually getting almost a prediction of, you know, how much does this stimulus match what we already know? And then that actually, it's after the fact that you get the feedback. So it might be that the brain's actually making a lot, I mean, obviously, but the brain's making a lot more predictions than our models would suggest. And so that's actually a point where I feel like the model needs to be extended and updated.
I mean, I'm just kind of going back to some of the talks earlier from Victor and from Petra, for example, where they're looking at quite detailed models of what the brain's doing. And you can envision, like Andrea had, you know, some ideas about how the behavior evolves. And those, I mean, they're not necessarily isomorphic in the sense you can swap them out because they do operate in different spatial and temporal scales. So it's a question of whether, you know, is it surprising then that if you actually use the neural signal, again, that it should work at all? Or is it something that's like, wow, this is actually telling us something?
Right. I mean, I'm not going to say that I expected it to work, but the regions that we did, the regions that we found were consistent with like other studies that have done it in this way that doesn't link it in the way that we did. So it seemed consistent. And if we were to find it, I would expect it to be there. But that it actually worked was very nice.
Great.
Thanks. Let's maybe go over to Q&A. There's been a question from Zepide Zadagiani for a while. Is the drift diffusion model showing improved behavioral predictions with use of brain activity, because the latter provides information about trial-by-trial variability of the brain's implementation of the DDM?
Yeah. That would be a good way to interpret that. The thing I didn't say is that we actually also looked at the signal from lateral prefrontal cortex, and it correlates with category evidence. So you can fit like an exemplar model to people's decisions and get an idea of how much evidence people have on a trial-by-trial basis for making a particular decision. And so that LPFC activation actually correlates with that. So we also have, it's linked to the drift diffusion model, and it's also linked to category evidence. And so that gives us a handle on what's actually being computed there. There's another model called exemplar-based random walk theory, EBRW, that actually puts those two models together. And so we talk about this result as kind of reflecting this category-driven random walk idea.
And there's also a question by Dennis Kumral. Thanks for the nice and informative talk. I have two questions. And the first one is, typically perception, learning, or memory are studied in the context of discrete words, images, as you presented. then it's easy to just to decode them using MVPA, SBM, whatever. However, real life experience is different. For instance, continual streams of stimuli. How would you implement such behavioral models in the real life experiences, stimuli, for instance, using movies? Maybe let's have the first question first.
I guess I kind of saw them as the same question, but or that was the first question, right? There's another one.
That's
coming.
The first question, yes.
Yeah. So I think incorporating these, since I'm always dealing with visual stimuli, we can now leverage these deep learning models that give us a much more rich featurescape to look at how these things change in a more sort of dynamic way. What I glossed over with a model like Sustain is it is a neural network model. And so you don't necessarily need it to run in these sort of punctate sort of trials, right? You can have it run sort of continuously. And I think that, that's the way forward. One thing that I've started to look at is basically how can you just do unsupervised learning, just give people a bunch of experiences of new stimuli and we're going to do this with our scenes that we can continuously change. Can we see that these models arrive at sort of important boundaries between categories without even really knowing anything about them, right? It's just sort of, this is what the feature space gives you. And that sort of really gets more at this idea of it being sort of dynamic input.
Indeed, closely related is the second part or the second question. If you have objects as types of flowers or bugs versus insects discrete behaviorally, should we always expect discrete, distinct patterns in the brain based on models as well? Thanks for your reply. So does the discreteness of the stimuli then beget discreteness of the model?
Yeah, it's a great question. And that's what we're studying right now. So can we take this to more continuous feature spaces? What we studied so far in the brain has been very discrete for practical purposes. But now, and the whole field is changing this way too. Can we start learning more about the manifolds that we're creating that define category boundaries, rather than just a simple plain, can we deal with these continuous features? That's a very key, research direction for the future.
Thank you. There are a few more, I think maybe more technical questions in the Q&A, and maybe I would leave them for you to handle after the session, because we're a little bit over. And I also want to thank all the panelists again for a really amazing session, which was really broadening our minds, going all the way from dynamical systems theory to behavioral dimension. I think it was a very stimulating afternoon, morning, or evening, wherever you are. And so great, and thanks very much to all the panelists. Also to everyone who still did the homework of the Q&A afterwards. I saw Bratislav sort of typing away furiously and answering lots and lots of questions. So thank you very much for all your efforts and for your contribution. And with that, I'll hand back to Rennie McIntosh for some housekeeping and the closing of the session.
Okay, thank you, Klaus. And I want to just echo Klaus's comments. It was actually a really good session. I'm very pleased how well it worked given the format. Hopefully it will continue tomorrow. Bratislav and Rosalind, if you're actually listening to me, can you turn your cameras on just for 1 second so we can get a quick screen capture for, hey, there she is, for history. And while we're doing that, while we're waiting for Bratislav, there he is. He's watching the football game. Okay, Tanya, shoot, quick. So tomorrow's session, we started later, 1700 UTC, which is painfully late, I know, in Europe, and early afternoon for us in North America. Be sure to convert that to your local time so you're actually able to join us as best you can. The Zoom links you have that you used today will be the same for the remainder of the conference, so just use the same link. tomorrow we'll have a lot more of the kinds of discussion that we were having with Michael's presentation and shorter presentations. So the presentations, again, will be more on the 15-minute side of things with 5 creatively composed slides, followed by roughly 45 minutes for discussion. We'll start actually tomorrow morning, or tomorrow session, pardon me, with what's called the Rolf Cotter lecture, which is the only full-length talk from Giulio Tononi. And I'll give you some background on that tomorrow. Tomorrow, I want to say morning, but tomorrow when we reconvene. Anything else I missed, Tanya, on that? We're all good to go. Okay, well, thanks again, everybody. You look lovely. And I look forward to seeing you all tomorrow on this Zoom channel. Enjoy the rest of your day or your evening. Bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.